Thank you everybody for joining us today or this evening. My name is Samantha Johnston. I'm the Executive Director and Curator here at Colorado Photographic Art Center. We're so excited to have you join us for the panel discussion connected to our exhibition Echoes of Injustice, which features three contemporary photographers who explore the traumatic legacy and lasting reverberations of the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. This exhibition is on view at our gallery in downtown Denver until June 21st. And we have gallery hours from Tuesday through Friday and Saturday. So please feel free to stop by if you are local to see the exhibition. I will also put in the chat, we have partnered with the Denver Public Library and have a list of books and music and movies and resources that um, go in hand with the exhibition. This is also being recorded today, so we will be putting this on the website probably tomorrow. So people have to cut out. They're welcome to come back and listen later. I'm so excited to have everyone, Renee, Dean, Jerry, and Brandon joining us today. I'm going to have each of the panelists kind of give a little introduction about their work. And then we're going to open up for further discussion. So I am going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. All right. And everyone, I think, should be able to see that. Um, and I'm going to have Renee, I'm going to have you go first. And let you
Sure.
and give a little introduction.
Okay. So I'll just start out by saying thank you to you, Samantha, and to the crew at CPAC for hosting this really important exhibit. And also to just say, what an honor it is to have my photographs next to Dean and Jerry's amazing work. So I'll just start by talking about how I came to do this project. So you could go to the next slide. So in 2016, it was the first election of our current administration, and I had been at the Library of Congress looking at the FSA file, which I highly recommend for everyone. And I was studying the work of Russell Lee and came across this photograph that he took in May of 1942 in Salinas, California, which is just down the road from where I live in Santa Clara. And this photograph, I just became very curious about it and the different aspects of it. These Japanese American women serving a traditional, American lunch with chopsticks and then also seeing that it's in an assembly center, which means that this was like government funded food. And that, I learned later, of course, that they're getting ready, they're having a meal before they're actually going to be sent to the camps, Japanese American concentration camps. So really this photograph stuck with me, and I was familiar with Manzanar and Tule Lake, and became familiar with other locations, but also began to think about how I was learning about this in a fragmented way, and thought uh, it would be really powerful and interesting if somebody created a pedagogical installation that included all 10 of the camp locations. So ultimately, I thought I would do this. And that was how this project began. I was able to receive from Santa Clara University funding as a Arts and Humanities Fellow twice, so that I could go to all 10 of the camps and find out, learn and create this installation. Um, and so you could go to the next slide if you'd like. And so I went to all locations, and I was not prepared for the vastness of the land and um, what it was I was supposed to be documenting. I just knew in my heart it was to needed to be there. So while I was photographing the camps, I was also looking at different archives, thanks to the work of Densho and some other archives. I learned a lot from looking at those photographs and then began to um, think about, look at my photos and see how my photos from the present and the past could come together to tell different aspects of the story. And then over a longer period of time, it took me 3 years to visit all the camps. I began to really learn and focus more on the land and the propagation of the land by Japanese Americans who were imprisoned there. They grew food for themselves, for other camps, for and the war effort. Um, and then also how that land is still, being profited from today, but not by Japanese Americans. And then how that land, after the governments closed the camps and Japanese Americans were um, sent, uh, how they handled the selling, the reestablishing of that land. So the 6 images that Samantha you selected for this exhibit, which work so well together, are part of a larger installation that include all 10 of um, the camp locations and then a few others to kind of tell stories. Um, I also decided it would be important to bring in some material culture. And so below each photograph, when you see them, is a shelf with a bowl of soil or dirt from not where I could take it. Usually it would be like outside the camp, but within the proximity of that area as a way of bringing a part of the camp to um, the community, the people that would be seeing the work, and also just having this like physical connection to the camp locations. So my audience is really the pedagogical aspect of it is for um, younger people who don't know this story or anyone who doesn't know this story, and the importance of it. And so that's, how I came to do this work. So you can see in this photo, it's a little hard to see, but this is my photograph of, this is actually a beet farm, and sugar beets is a big part, it still is, of what was grown. Um, and for sugar. So there's a whole other story behind beet farming in Japanese American during this time period. And so I thought, like, for a few of them, there are people in them. So for this particular photograph, these are farmers, not necessarily beet farmers, but I thought that it represented kind of this agricultural aspect um, of Japanese Americans being incarcerated. And then I've also sewn the photographs in using gold thread. So they're physically hand sewn into the photograph. And each one is 24 by 36 framed. And then here's an overview so you can see how the soil sits below each photograph. So, and I think that's it.
Yeah.
I'm next.
You're next, Jerry.
I guess I will try to do a 5-minute interpretation of the 56 years I've been making art um, leading up to this work. And so obviously I'm a fine art photographer, also a graphic designer, writer and curator. And, my degree was in art, emphasis in painting. And, but shortly after I graduated, I migrated over to photography because I was doing photoreal paintings. So in 1969, when I was living in Berkeley, I got beat up by the police one night. And several months later, there was an event called People's Park that lasted for about a week. So I decided in a way to express my feelings about the police and retaliate, I would photograph the riots. And some images were in an exhibition there in Berkeley and published in a book called People's Park. And at the same time, there was also environmental issues around DDT. The brown pelicans were not surviving. So I was moved to photograph the birds. And these events, I just there was this compelling feeling inside me that I need to speak for these people because they can't speak for themselves in a way. And I don't know that, at the time I just thought it was my personality. That was who I was. Of course, at this time now, I kind of look back and think that it has something to do with my upbringing in a Japanese, post-war Japanese American family. Um, there's there's a thing in Japanese culture called gaman, which is a Japanese term, kind of a Zen Buddhist origin, meaning enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. And this is something that was can be related to with the experience of being in the camps. And my parents, for all of my childhood, never really spoke ill of the politics, the social racism, things that were going on during the war, ending up, in the assembly centers and then in the camps. Um, but they would just, they kind of blew it off like it was a period of time in their lives. So they would say, it happened in camp or we met them in camp. So it was not really detail out what that was. And an example of how they deflected would be I had found these little carved bird pins in my grandfather's basement. And I brought them up to my mother and said, where did these come from? And her answer was basically, oh, someone in camp made those. And so that's how it went in my childhood. Basically, that I was kind of in the dark about what it really was. So probably spent the last 50 years of my life trying to understand this hybrid Japanese American point of view that I had and the motivation to speak for things that, could not maybe express themselves. And so over the last, well, at least 40 years, I've been working on these different series. And the first series that was really personal to me was called the Kimono series, and it's where I start using Japanese artifacts and embracing the fact that I kind of realized, I'm Japanese, and I didn't really think of it that way for such a long time. So the second series is called Landscapes Presence, and in that one, it was more in the studio. And I began to see creativity as a function of being in the present. And so that was that whole series. It was about time. The next series was called False Food. And I was seen at the aquarium, they had a display of plastic that was ingested and then killed the albatross on Midway. And I knew what to do with it, and I started working in the same kind of collage, narrative, still life kind of formula that I used and expressed. It was like learning a new language through my upbringing and becoming more and more articulate with that language. So when my parents passed away, I my brother and I found a box of photographs in which there were photographs of them in the camps, which I had never seen. None of us had ever seen it. It was just in the garage. So it kind of cemented some kind of reality to what actually had happened all those years, the stories I was getting. And it made me really kind of, I don't know, it was like a wake up call. Did a lot of research and became basically kind of angry and upset about what had happened to them and that they never really, they had to sacrifice any real emotion about that and because they were moving on and they were trying to give me a chance to love the United States because that's really what they were, the place where they were coming from. So, we have these pictures on in balancing cultures that you're seeing here. The the black and whites are intentionally made out of focus, kind of giving a sense of memory and time. And the poster that was so ubiquitous at the time has been shredded, and the shredded paper wanted to have some color in it, so I chose some bright color. And then artistically, and this is probably just coming from my painting background, I kind of felt like it needed some vertical elements. So I had these pieces of branches that I had collected. I have a lot of collections of things because when you do still life, you end up, collecting everything. And later on, someone said, it kind of looks like a prison cell. And to make these images, like this image here, I mean, this was the first image in the series. I was pretty upset about it because, my parents didn't speak about it. And so I was kind of betraying that silence. And so the first time I showed it to some people outside of the immediate group, my family, I was kind of nervous because I don't know. It was just sort of in me to be afraid, but I got an incredible response and it kind of encouraged me to keep going with the series. So you can go to the next slide, I guess there. Yeah, this picture well, the possession of navigational charts really is the part of a news reporting story in the Monterey Herald where the FBI had arrested some people, and my father was amongst them because he had navigational charts, being in the fishing industry, and he also had a flashlight and a knife or something. So anyway, and then the photograph is actually it's in the camp in Arkansas in Jerome, and my father is sort of center in the back. The little boats. I had done the series False Food with Plastic, and I didn't have any kind of hint about what it was, but they were kind of abstract and beautiful, but they were made from, kind of instruments of death. And I was told when I did that work that maybe it isn't direct enough. And so I kind of added a lot of text in the series Balancing Cultures, which I hadn't done before. and I was looking for different ways, and all the images have sort of different ways of expressing text. In this case, they're just these cut out little letters to actually spell out the article, but really hard to read. So anyway, the little boats are navigational charts made to be little origami boats, and it's basically kind of a metaphor for the absurdity of the charges of possessing, dangerous materials. So these images are just, narrative storytelling about what I believe their feelings would have been, and also, I can't but help overlay my feelings on them. So it's kind of a combination of both my parents and myself expressing something here. You can go to the next one. I don't know what oh, that one. Okay. Yeah, memories essentially just my family. My grandfather on my mother's side had a number of businesses, and the fish market on Fisherman's Wharf was one of the businesses he had. He had been on the peninsula here for 35 plus years before he was sent to the camps. Of course, he was sent to a more of a military prison because he was an elder, and my parents and his wife were sent to more of a general population prison in Jerome. But anyway, yeah, again, adding in these little documents and things just to help do a little narration and kind of bring people into the story. And that's kind of how this whole series kind of went, as far as it's been going for 9 years now, and it still seems to, again, it came out when Trump was elected in 2016, and it seems like it's not losing any momentum yet. So anyway, that's oh, and this is one of the install shots of that. Yeah, but yeah, that should get us started.
Thank you, Jerry. Dean.
Unmuting. Um, so I guess my story starts with my parents as well. Um, when I was a kid, I'm down in the basement and I come across a box that had my father's photographs and keepsakes from his service in World War II. He was a member of the 442nd, which was the all Japanese American um, fighting unit that fought in Italy and France. Um, and uh, I probably had an adolescent kid's fascination with war, and I'd ask Dad about him, and he wouldn't say much. But when he retired, he started going to these reunions of his unit, and um, sort of simultaneous with this, my cousin at a family gathering asked that everyone watch this movie that he had bought. So we all gathered around a television with a VHS attached and watched this film about what had happened with the 442nd 100th Battalion. And the film stopped, and it was kind of quiet in the room. And I think everyone might have been staring at Dad, and he walked out of the room. And so I followed him outside because I was a little worried and checked on him, and he was sobbing. Um, there was a point in this movie where they talked about the 442nd being used as cannon fodder. And there was this experience, I guess, where because these young men had been taken aside and told by their parents um, that if they were going to serve, they should serve with honor. They should do as they were told. Um, and they shouldn't do anything that would bring shame on the family. And that last sentence, I basically became almost a death sentence for a lot of those soldiers because rather than question an order that was going to put them in imminent danger, they would charge a machine gun nest or whatever had to be done. And many times that cost them their lives. So the other part of this story is that um, my father, I came to learn, um, was initially in after the war started and he turned 18, issued a draft card that said that he wasn't eligible because he was an enemy alien. He had been born in Denver. He was the youngest in a large family, and he spoke very little Japanese. His brothers and sisters would basically listen to his parents, his mother scolding him and explain to him what was going on. By the tone of voice, I think he knew, um, but because my father was in Denver and my mother was in Nebraska, they were not incarcerated. Um, but because of his service and because of what I had learned about um, his experience with soldiers who had been incarcerated, um, I always felt a need to honor this story. But the story wasn't mine, really. And so in 2012, this couple was remodeling this building. They found some letters. Um, um, the letters had been written from all 10 of the camps, plus two of the federal detention sites, to a business called TK Pharmacy. So my father's oldest brother was the pharmacist at TK Pharmacy. Business was owned by Thomas Kobayashi, who was TK. And he was a medical doctor, and his practice was upstairs in the building where these letters were found. The letters weren't found, I assume, for some 68 years after they'd been somehow lost. They ended up in a wall, and when this building was being remodeled, they found these letters. The letters were mail order requests that had been sent to the pharmacy, and there was writing on them that made it pretty apparent that my uncle Talk was filling these orders and when he could, and he'd send them back their money or send them an inquiry, or he was familiar with some of the Japanese medicines that he couldn't obtain, and was finding substitutes and sending things to Poston, to Gila River, to all 10 of the camps. Um, so I discovered these letters. Densho had the letters. The couple donated them after holding them for a few years. Densho put them online, I think, in about 2018. I didn't discover them until um, after my father had passed on in 2022, and I felt this obligation to tell this story, um, which I think is a story about um, what that experience looked like. The letters are requests for things like skin lotion. Uh, there's a lot of requests for hair dye. We can speak about that maybe in a minute. Um, there are requests for medicine, lots of stomach remedies. Um, and there were lots of requests for sake, which the pharmacy was unable to fill for a while. But later it was declared not to be contraband, and they would send that. So what we're looking at is a postcard sent from Heart Mountain. It is one of the letters. Um, and we're looking at the physical plant for the hospital at Heart Mountain. And if you look carefully at the postcard, it's hard to see here, but there is uh, uh, um, an aerial shot of the camp, and you begin to get a little sense of the scale of that. There's just barrack after barrack after barrack. Um, um, the we could, I think, go to the next slide. So I'm using Photoshop, and I'm going to the camps. Densho is providing access to their digital files, and I use um, Photoshop to montage the letters onto the site. I'm actually looking toward the Jerome camp, which I believe was located just across this highway. The monument is a little down the road from here, but the camp I'm sure was right where we're staring. Um, there was a set of railroad tracks there, and both of my grandparents had connections to the railroad. Um, and a letter asking for art supplies. There's actually a date stamp on it that I believe was left there by the pharmacy. There's writing in red um, that is, I believe, this woman that worked for my uncle in the store, who was reading the letters, and basically she'd summarize what they're asking for. In this case, some writing brushes and some ink. We could maybe go to the next slide. So this piece is called Send Me Anything. It's uh, one of the letters that's in English, and the letter it has this list of things that this person would like to have, but in the course of asking for this letter is really remarkable. It begins, um, again, I bring you trouble. And it is this salutation, which is in the most polite way possible to say, I'm asking you to do this thing. And please accept my apology for that. And then the letter just has this list of items that they want. And then it concludes, please don't send back my check. Send me anything. We're looking at a reconstructed child's playground that is close to where the children's excuse me, the children's orphanage was at Manzanar. It's a remarkably beautiful place, and it's just horrifying. Sort of, people died there. Um, um, anyway, so I guess we could move on. Um, so this is an installation of photographs that I made with the intention of making montages, but at this point haven't found the letter that goes with those images. Um, so it's an array that represents my journey to these camps at this point. I visited Gila River quite some, like back in the 90s. The other camps I've visited since 2022. I still have two of the major camps to go to and one of the federal detention facilities. So I've been working on this since late 2022. And um, I am hoping that these images sort of speak to the kind of mystery that I felt of not understanding what this other story was. Many of my parents' friends were incarcerated at Amachi and made their way to Denver after the war. Um, and that sort of mystery that I felt as a young Japanese American of learning about what that experience was, of what had happened to the people that had answered no to the loyalty questions that the incarcerated people were handed, and about the honor that those soldiers felt so strongly toward their parents to make sure that they reflected well on the community and proof that they were American citizens with their lives. So that might be a good place to stop. I don't know how many more slides we have.
That was it. I just wanted to show both because I wanted to show the install of the images with the letters on them. So
Okay. Um, the center triptych is made out of one image, and it has three letters that are all asking for various medicines. Um, I don't know that we saw one you might be able to see these little rectangular redacted areas. Densho is preserving the privacy of individuals that wrote the letters because they're describing medical ailments and um, so that should be published. So they erase names and address with a white rectangle, which I make into a clear one so we can see through to the image behind.
great. Thank you, Dean. I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Brandon, I'm going to give a quick because doesn't have work in the show, but Brandon recently published another book, The Afterlife is Letting Go. And I recently heard him interviewed on KUNC as I was putting this exhibition together and thought I wanted you to participate in the panel. So I just want to give a little more intro for you, Brandon.
Yeah, thank you. Um, and thank you so much for inviting me. And thanks to Dean and Jerry and Renee. Yes, I'm the interloper. I'm not a photographer. I don't have work in the show. But I was thinking if I was a photographer, I would probably wish that I was making work like yours. Um, I'm really grateful for all of what you're doing. I was thinking, as a way to introduce myself, Dean was just talking about the mystery, using that word mystery that you felt. And I was thinking about how, so perhaps I'm a generation younger. Um, I feel like that mystery is inexhaustible and inextinguishable. And I think about the incarceration experience for younger generations as an inheritance. And I think that part of that inheritance is mysterious. Um, so, Dean, thanks so much for uh, thinking about it in that way. My connection to the history is primarily through my grandfather, who was an immigrant from Hiroshima. His parents immigrated first to Hawaii. They went back to Japan. He was born, and then my grandfather immigrated alone in 1919. He was in one of the Department of Justice prisons. And this is not something that I knew at all growing up. It's not something we ever talked about. This is a very common story. I've heard it many times. People even two generations younger than me who grew up in families that had this shared history that didn't know anything about it. At this point in 2025, we're supposed to know about this history. And in fact, the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 allotted $50 million so that every school child in the US would learn it. That $50 million got cut down to 3 million, and it went somewhere. It went into many really valuable, important projects. But again, as I said, people who share this history continue to grow up without knowledge or understanding of it. So I'm a writer, I think, in part because I had have a lot of questions. And the questions took the form of angst and confusion and missing. So I think that's actually first. I think that precedes the writing. So I wrote a book about my grandfather called The Grave on the Wall, and that was an attempt to get to know him better and to understand his experience. But the mystery kept going. So I wrote another book, and this is the book that Samantha mentioned, The Afterlife is Letting Go. This is one of my grandfather's photos on the front. I don't say that he took photographs. I say that he made photographs. He was a photographer because it has the quality of a drawing. This was made in the 30s, I think the late 30s, so not too long before the war. I'm going to read the shortest chapter in this book, which is 2 pages long. What I'll say about this book, there's many things to say about it, but one of the significant things for me is that I spoke to maybe 300 survivors and descendants of the camps and the prisons and just asked them questions about their experience. And I centered the experience of descendants because I was and I continue to be very curious about what this history means to the people who weren't there. And so this chapter is a collage of every time somebody would say something that began with the words, "I remember." I just kept note of all that. And then I pared that down into this chapter, which is called Saving the Incense. I remember a memory. I remember thinking I was old enough to have memories. I remember playing war with Grandma. I remember her complaining about the lack of privacy. I remember seeing a photo of the bathrooms. I remember being aghast. I remember Mom talking about camp. I remember thinking she had gone to summer camp. I remember her describing how the barracks were made. I remember Mom talking about the wind blowing sand into the barracks. I remember how the camps changed her relationship with her identity. I remember telling her I thought she didn't speak Japanese, and she laughed and said she didn't. I remember it was blazing hot. I remember driving around the reservation as the sun was setting. I remember the white monument in the cemetery. I remember a plaque. I remember thinking, is this it? Is this all that's left? I remember being disappointed. I remember my father pointing out where some of the things would have been. I remember them pointed out on a map. I remember my mom pointing out people in a sea of names. I remember looking up my relatives' names in the roster. I remember getting out of the car. I remember how windy it was. I remember the hot wind whipping my hair. I remember looking at the fields. I remember the plants. I remember feeling like I was intruding. I remember a heaviness. I remember asking what internment meant. I remember asking a few times. I remember asking my sister. I remember never discussing it at school. I remember a small paragraph in my textbook. I remember a book report. I remember a very short assignment. I remember winning an award for the assignment. I remember looking conspicuous. I remember people did not believe the camps existed. I remember being angry. I remember feeling like it wasn't my story to tell. I remember my grandmother saying they could only take what fit in 2 suitcases. I remember her telling me about answering no, no on the questionnaire. I remember a relative who served in the 442nd. I remember bringing his medals to school. I remember Grandpa was emotional. I remember grandmother was sad. I remember a kimono Grandma had. I remember sitting in my grandparents' living room. I remember I had a list of questions. I remember being surprised at how matter-of-fact they were. I remember being confused because I had no context. I remember being ashamed. I remember not wanting to ask Grandma to clarify. I remember hearing Grandpa was jailed for being a spy. I remember Mother justifying why. I remember asking my dad about propaganda. I remember seeing it on TV. I remember thinking, why wasn't everyone watching? I remember being confused by the lack of engagement. I remember it feeling like it wasn't a big deal. I remember feeling disconnected. I remember my dad telling me to never identify my race on a form. I remember my father taking off his glasses. I remember him talking in his sleep. I remember hearing my mom and aunts and grandpa talk about reparations. I remember my grandparents receiving a check in the mail. I remember being angry at the government because the check arrived late. I remember my parents showing me the check. I remember my mom explaining what it was. I remember when grandma got the letter from the president. I remember seeing the letter. I remember my father valuing the apology more than the money. I remember he would point to the letter on the wall. I remember mom saying she wished her parents were still alive. I remember grandmother launching small paper boats. I remember watching grandfather light incense. I remember thinking, is this something I'm supposed to do? I remember feeling awe and relief. I remember the smell. I remember saving the incense. Thank you.
Samantha, you're muted.
I'm muted. Thank you. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you for reading that. Thank you for reading that section. Really powerful. And I wanted to just spend some time. I had a few questions and I didn't mention at the start of the talk, but if others have questions, please feel free to utilize the Q&A or the chat. And I will read those as well. I know we have one, which I'll get to in a minute. But I also wanted to have a little bit of discussion around internment camps versus concentration camps. Something I know I read a lot about before as I was putting this exhibition together, but I wanted if you could all speak a little bit about that in your experiences about the work.
I guess I can start and I'll talk about the title because of the exhibit that I created. Um, uh, yeah, so I had previously done some work with the National Holocaust Museum in DC. And while I had just started this project, and so that I began to think about um, my visiting the camps and learning about the camps and doing the research and what the term meant, and also knowing that the terms like relocation, internment, all of those are, particularly relocation, are government terms that are ways, in my perspective was that these were ways for the government to kind of justify what they had done, and so I wanted to get away from that and really looked at what the term concentration camp means. And it really fit, like, it really fit more. So and I made the choice. And as Jerry said, I was really nervous when I first, used that title, 10 Japanese American concentration camps. But it was important for me to have that as a way of informing individuals that would be coming to the exhibit. And then, since then, or I mean, probably around that time, I also know that um, I was the preferred definition. That's what I have heard, and now I hear it being used more and more. It just seems more accurate to me, um, and not to take away, from what has happened in the Holocaust, but I think it's really important as a way of acknowledging what has happened also in the United States. And there's a lot to unpack with this. So that refer to, because the title was really important for me, as to have it be part of the exhibit.
And I fully asked that question knowing it is a huge topic. We're not going to fully unpack it in this dialogue today, but Jerry, did you?
Well, I can kind of read a little thing that I came across when I was doing the book for Balancing Cultures. There was a meeting between the Japanese American Museum and the American Jewish leaders in New York. And I think it was when the Japanese American Museum was going to be doing this exhibition around the camps. And they together wrote this definition. A concentration camp is a place where people are imprisoned not because of any crimes they committed, but simply because of who they are. And so it kind of helps, clarify what it could be in that context. Um, and also as opposed to the death camps that were in World War II. So, but just gathering people not because of anything they did. That's a pretty clear definition.
Thank you both.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have anything to add to that. It's just um, that the the government was controlling the vocabulary, and they were using the words relocation and um, internment as a way of making what they were doing more palatable, of making it seem less violent.
Yeah.
I would also imagine, because I think not too long into the whole process of incarceration, that it was becoming clearer and clearer that the sabotage issue was a mistake, and it must have been harder and harder to work the words at that point. In the beginning, it was heated, and then I'm sure it became a little bit more tricky. If you look at all the documents that were being issued at the time, it's, it's but in the end, the government never really ever wanted to admit that they had done something wrong, and it didn't really come up until much later. So,
Can I just add to what Jerry was saying? By virtue of the definition that you just shared, Jerry, of what a concentration camp is, we have many, many concentration camps in the United States. But not only that, I think we need to redefine the definition, redefine the meaning of crime.
Mm.
There are also many thousands of people in the United States who are incarcerated for having committed a crime that I think by any measure of reality is not a crime at all, but a crime that was hallucinated and then imposed by the government. So then, by extension, that there are many, many concentration camps in the United States, and perhaps there have always been.
Yeah.
yeah, I'd agree.
Mhm.
Well, and I also want to, as we're talking about the government, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which Brandon and I talked briefly about when we were talking about the panel and kind of things that had come up most recently, again with our current president, reissuing that and how that, was issued in order to intern Japanese Americans in camps on our soil. And so I think that history you spoke of, Brandon, not knowing that history, I think is, Renee, I remember you and I chatted, after you had been at Society for Photographic Education, and someone coming up to you after saying thank you for sharing your talk and your exhibition, because they had never learned any of that in school.
Yes, that did happen. It was a young person who knew a lot about World War II, but had never actually had heard about this part of it. Um, I also wanted to say one more thing about this term relocation, because I hear that a lot. And from the research that I've done, I can't help but think that this was also not just a relocating to the camp, but relocating people from the Pacific Northwest, with this intention of like forever and ever relocating them. And so when I hear that, knowing what I know, I just, it just kind of cringe because when Japanese Americans left the camps, they were not returned. They were not, given a ticket or even transportation back to the Pacific Northwest where they lived, but they went to the Midwest. So then they had to find their way, back. So, so I think that these terms are how we use them is important. So.
Absolutely. Well, and I know we have a handful of questions that have come in, so I want to leave some time for that as well. I know someone had asked, and I knew I'd heard about this a year ago. The Denver Botanic Gardens showed a short documentary called Amachi Rose. Um, and this person was wondering, Renee, if you had any part in its production.
No, I did not, but I would be interested in knowing more about it.
I've seen the movie. It is brilliant. Um, if you are in Denver, you can see a cutting from the Omachi rose growing at the Denver Botanic Gardens. Um, the story is that they found a rose growing next to the foundation for one of the buildings, and they believe that it was a rose that was transplanted from uh, the nearby river, which I can't name at this moment. Um, that that rose grows wild down in the riverbed, but doesn't grow where the camp was.
Mm.
But the foundations provide sort of protection from evaporation, and so they're the plants that I think Renee has photographed there at Amachi trees um, are either planted by or the offspring of trees planted by the incarcerated people. So
Mhm.
this rose survived, and it survived 70 years, I think, before they found it.
Yeah. I know that there still are seeds that have survived. Also, the camps, there's something similar. There's an Amachi like cantaloupe that the seeds have been passed down generations and generations. And so that's an interesting perspective. There's also those trees that are there are still there, whether they're dead or alive, and they have a lot to tell about, and that's true in Amachi and other locations. The plants and the soil that is there, like they hold the story, and I'm really interested in that. So.
We have another question. My grandmother was interned at Heart Mountain, and after she got out, committed to raising her children as quote unquote American as possible, both in public and private. If it's okay to ask, I'm curious to what extent the manifestation of your family's Japanese heritage changed, if at all. I'm especially curious how your family's public-facing image compared and or contrasted with the ideas of being Japanese at home.
Mm.
Well, let me see. I believe my parents who are were Nisei, um, they were born in California, and they grew up in California, and I kind of think that they already felt like they were American and and pretty much, behaved just like all American kids. And my grandparents, on the other hand, were from Japan, and they had a lot more of the traditions, and they operated, you know, a Japanese restaurant and a hotel and various businesses that were kind of, around the location in Monterey that they chose. The sea, which is sort of like their origins, and but I don't, I know that I was pretty much admonished to become, be American, get an education, and don't let what happened to them happen to me.
So my parents were also Nisei. Um, it means second generation, and it means that my grandparents came to this country. Um, I my paternal grandfather had come here seeking an opportunity. The In Japan, the oldest son uh, is basically going to inherit what wealth is in the family, and the other sons are basically going to function at the whim of that oldest son. Um, and it's kind of a complex story, but um, he sensed that there was a greater opportunity for him here, and um, he the Asian cliche, he was good at math and basically made his way up to be a clerk and eventually a manager of an import business. Um, my father, as I said, was the youngest, and so while his older siblings learned to speak Japanese, uh, dad was. There's a picture of my father. Think this is this could be after the war, but he's wearing a raccoon skin jacket and holding a saxophone, and he wants to be an American. The story I heard, though, is pretty great. He actually served in the 100th Battalion of the 442nd. The 100th Battalion was primarily Hawaiians. The oldest, the most experienced soldiers were Hawaiian. And I heard a story that when he came back from uh, Europe after the war, that he kept asking his mom for rice at dinner. That he didn't want potatoes and he didn't want spaghetti. Um, he he wanted rice because that's what Japanese people ate. And so there's this little irony about the US Army teaching my father how to be Japanese. Um, um, they didn't talk about it a lot. I went home once in like second grade and asked my mom what the J word meant. I didn't recognize that I was that different. But some kids had yelled that to me, and obviously it had some impact to them that I didn't understand. Um, yeah.
To add to that, we're using the word American, but what I think we mean is white. Because ideally, you could live in a country and not change anything about who you are and still be American, quote unquote. Um, so I think that's important to recognize, and how the concentration camps were also, as they were imagined by the government, assimilation camps. That was the idea, because these were unassimilable aliens, whether they were citizens or not. Um, I'm mixed race. My mother's white. My father's Japanese. There's a million reasons why that could be the case. But I do know that after the war, yeah, I think I wouldn't say the Japanese side of my family strive to be more American. I think they strive to be more white. Um, and that's an impossible thing to achieve, of course. So, I think this is something I do think about all the time, and many people of my generation and younger are mixed race. And it's an interesting thing to consider what that means about being a Japanese American. I think it diversifies the nature of that experience. Um, it's a really great question, and it's a pretty sad and I think fascinating one to try to answer.
Absolutely. And on that, we have kind of someone else had asked, I'm interested in the notion that some survivors kept their experience private because they wanted their children to be proud of America. I believe Jerry touched on this. How do you grapple with the duality of your generational trauma and being an American citizen?
Still working on it. Um, yeah. I always looked at the process of gaman, which is basically the silence that they pretty much collectively decided post-war that it was the right thing to do. It is actually, it seems like a cultural get out of jail free card in a way. It's like culturally allowed because what they all experienced in the Japanese culture is shame for being considered the enemy. And that was something that, in a way, is almost impossible to live down. So they're given this opportunity to just not talk about it and let it go. And because it wasn't going to do any good, at least in terms of talking to the communities that they moved back to about it. So, plus, I think, as I did say, it was trying not to influence how I saw the world from, as from a child, and that they were able to conceal that. I assume, anger and indignation for what had happened. I always marvel at the fact that they were able to do that. And so there's some kind of energy about that process of Gaman, about being able to reframe a situation that is just the worst possible one and make it okay enough to move forward and actually continue your life almost from where you thought you left it off. So I'm kind of fascinated by the notion of what that means because it's a change of perception. And I think that, as a world that we live in, I think we're in a crisis of perception. Um, how we see the world is not really up to what, maybe, modern science would have us believe. We're still back a couple hundred years ago. And so, it's still a very material universe. And I think there's a more fluid world to be had um, in terms of being able to get along with people and to, I guess, in a sense, if Gaman has something like forgiveness in it, being able to just forget and move on. Um, it's something that, I mean, the way that we seem to be headed now anyway, as a global community, it doesn't look like it's going to turn out very well because we're not, paying attention to the fact that we all need each other to survive, but we're not seeing that. So I don't know. There's something in Gaman that I'm still exploring.
Thank you, Jerry. I don't have other questions. Are there any other questions in our audience that are still there? This has been fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Well, I think I'm going to leave it there. Jerry, thank you for that. I think that was a great way to kind of end it. Thank you all for sharing about your work. And Brandon, thank you for sharing about your book. And I'll send a link out as well to the book. I think I just saw someone's hand raised. Someone has one more question. But it doesn't look like it's up still. Anyway, as I said, the exhibition is on until June 21st. Thank you, everyone, for coming this evening, for listening, and thank you all for sharing about the work more. And thank you, everyone, for participating in this programming. And yeah, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.